Buenos días. Vamos a continuar con el programa y quiero presentarles a nuestra conferenciante invitada, Alison Campbell, a quien conocí hace ya bastantes años, no sé si fue en una reunión de la Asociación Europea de Transferencia, también pude estar con ella en reuniones de UTM, la Asociación Americana, y tengo que decir, y he podido trabajar con ella también en algún grupo de trabajo del Joint Research Center, y la verdad es que para mí es una de las personas con las ideas más claras en materia de transferencia en el mundo, con lo cual es un auténtico honor poder traerla y que pueda estar en una sesión como esta jornada de UPV-innovación, en esta cuarta jornada que siempre queremos que haya alguna charla, conferencia inspiradora, como lo han sido las 3 ediciones anteriores. Bien, deciros que la doctora Alison Campbell es actualmente la directora ejecutiva de la Oficina Gubernamental para la Transferencia de Tecnología del Gobierno británico desde abril de este año y que anteriormente fue la directora de Transferencia de Conocimiento en Knowledge Transfer Ireland. Fue la CEO de esa iniciativa que para mí también es una de las más interesantes acciones en política nacional sobre transferencia de conocimiento. Ella comenzó su carrera en la industria biotecnológica con diversos cargos en materia de transferencia de conocimiento en el Medical Research Council del Reino Unido y ha sido una persona con una gran contribución a la profesión de la transferencia de tecnología, tanto como en la presidencia de UTM, en ASTP y también como fundadora en ATTP, que es un poco la asociación internacional que genera los estándares globales de la profesión de transferencia. En el año 2018 recibió el Global University Venture Lifetime Achievement Award, un premio relevante, y también recibió una orden del Imperio Británico, un OBE, en 2010 en reconocimiento a su contribución a la transferencia de conocimientos. Bien, es una suerte poder tenerla aquí y, doctora Campbell, the floor is yours.
Pop those down there. I'm very short. Fernando, thank you so much. Thank you for such a very kind introduction. It's strange as you, thank you very much. As you get a little older and you look back at your career and you have somebody that you value their opinion very much, saying some very kind things about you, and you stand here and you think, how did this happen? So to any of the younger people in the audience, which will be the majority of you, what I would say was, be prepared to be surprised with what your life brings you. When I graduated, I thought a PhD would be the way to go. It seemed that I'd only started my scientific career and my scientific journey. And I was so fortunate that I did my PhD in an absolutely wonderful lab. And I realized that I was never going to be as good as some of the people that I was working with, because they ate, slept, dreamed the science. And I actually like to do a few other things, which wasn't just all about the science. So I decided that I'd really like to go into industry. And I think that's really where my career began to take off. And it's all about, we've talked here already about entrepreneurial. And I think that for all of us, actually, careers are about being a little bit entrepreneurial and just seeing the art of the possible and stepping forward and taking a little bit of a risk. I'm here today to give you some perspectives on international knowledge transfer. And I'm going to start off by describing my current role, which really has been a very large risk and step into the unknown. I'm in a job that has a lot of ambition, a lot of expectation, very few resources, little points of leverage, some degree of influence, and a lot of hope. And some expectations that we might deliver in the short term as well, which need to be managed, which is also a theme of the talk. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that and what that means. And then I'm just going to share with you just some of my own thoughts, some of the trends that I've seen internationally within the knowledge transfer and technology transfer space. I hope that what I will show you and talk to you about, for some of you, in some parts, may be of interest. And for those of you for whom it's of less interest, keep smiling, let's keep engaged, and if there's opportunity for questions, you can, well, let's take a risk there. So, let me see if I am actually capable of moving this on. And here I am. So, personal reflections. I'd like to introduce to you where I'm working at the moment, which is the UK Government Office for Technology Transfer. As Fernando said, I arrived there in April last year, and it's been a roller coaster. It's been really, really fascinating to try and do something that hasn't existed before. So here are the fine words. What are we here to do? What on earth is the Government Office of Technology Transfer? As you'll find out in a couple more slides, what does that name actually mean and what do names mean? We've been created to help support the public sector, government-funded administration, government-funded laboratories, to think more about the intellectual property and the knowledge assets that they may have and how they can best develop those and exploit them. So it's about introducing the concept of valorization and some of the practical ways that you can go about that to actually an untapped sector in the UK. So UK universities have been engaged in knowledge transfer and technology transfer for quite a long time. They're quite good at it, as many of us are throughout Europe. When we look at some of our public sector institutions, and that's anything from a central government department, a ministry, like that responsible for finance or for education, they are less used to thinking about what they might have there in terms of these intangible assets. We're also responsible not just for helping ministries, and goodness me, that's tough, think about what they may have, but also what some of the bodies that they fund and that are associated with them. And that can be anything from deep tech, for example, our Science and Technology Facilities Council, all the way through to some of our museums and our galleries, through to our metrology office, our National Physics Laboratory. But it's not all science. As I said, we've got museums in there. We're doing work with the Government Internal Audit Agency. It's a really, really widespread. And I'll come back to risk there in a minute. So part of the job, although my history is around supporting knowledge transfer and enacting knowledge transfer, and there are elements of that which I'll talk to you about in this job, it's also a job about culture change, and that's quite exciting, and that requires people. So we're using the word knowledge assets, and the reason we're using the word knowledge assets is that this all came from our government department, our Treasury department, the Ministry for Finance, who decided that when they were looking at the balance sheet review, that these intangible assets that sat all the way across government just really weren't being developed and exploited properly. So for our intangible assets, IP, data sets, processes, methods, know-how, expertise, Many of those could be called intellectual property, but I think there's a lot of confusion. Often people think of intellectual property rights and then they think of patents and they don't think of that broader space. So knowledge assets are what we're talking about. And for us, exploitation and valorization is commercialization as we know it, but it's also about opportunities for new processes and products and ways of doing things to be shared across government. And it's about open source, and it's about thinking about how these good things can be used for collaboration and for consultancy. Right now, it's fairly early days, and we're particularly thinking around the sharing across government, licensing opportunities, and with some eye in the future onto spin-out companies. There's a little picture at the bottom there of something called the Rose Book that looks small and pink, but it is quite significant. The government in the UK produces a variety of guides that tell you how to do certain things. So the Orange Book is a really good financial guide and manual published by the government that all public sector organisations need to think about. And last year, we developed, and the government published on our behalf, something called the Rose Book, or the Pink Book. And that basically talks about knowledge assets and knowledge transfer and why they're important and why various public sector organisations really need to think about them, and then some of the basics that they need to think about. So for me, that's quite significant because that actually says this is a really important policy objective in government. As I said, we're pretty much in startup mode. This is the history. I mentioned right back at the beginning this balance sheet review. And you can see there that happened in 2017. So it took a good 4 or 5 years before our office was created. But along the way, there was a study undertaken and a report published in 2021 called the Macintosh Report. In the UK, we really like to review areas, bring in somebody very important externally who can control, lead and oversee that process of review and produce a really nice analysis and a set of recommendations. That was a Macintosh report, and one of the recommendations, as well as all of these organisations needing to do more of this and do it better or even start to think about it, one of the recommendations was to create our office, the Government Office of Technology Transfer. This isn't the first time this has happened to me. When I went to Ireland in 2013, Ireland doesn't do so many of these kinds of reviews, but they had a marvellous policy intervention where they brought together investors, industry, researchers, people from government agencies, technology transfer people, and said, how can we make our system of knowledge transfer and technology transfer better? They came up with something called the National IP Protocol, which was a set of guides that had been collectively developed by many different actors. And one of the recommendations was we should produce a new office to think about this. So I seem to be now developing a career which is coming in and creating new offices on the back of various recommendations. And we can only hope I have as much success here as the last time round. So we want to create value for the UK through government-owned knowledge assets. We want more organisations and people across government to get more excited and more engaged about this. And how we're going to go about it is raising the profile, actually getting people wanting to do this, connecting communities of people across government with an interest in or who've got some activity within the area, and then provide practical support around new opportunity development, around funding, new policies, and guiding people to the right expertise. I don't want to leave you with the impression that we are a central office to manage all of the knowledge transfer and commercialisation across the public sector in the UK. If we were, we would probably need to be an office of about 200 people. And if we were, it would be a very bad experiment, because I'm a firm believer that if you centralise things too much, you actually lose the joy you lose the value. You need local connections. You need things to be happening locally. So we have a central coordination role. We need to encourage, we need to influence. We have people with technology transfer background who can almost act as consultants and provide advice. But ultimately where we want to get to is the various organisations and people we deal with being in a position where they can think through this and manage these aspects for themselves. So really, what I'd like to do is make sure that as swiftly as possible I can make myself redundant. This is what we do in one slide, and just some very key things to pull out of this. Some of them I've already showed you. Right on the left, there's a circle with a little B in it. That's the emblem of Manchester. We're headquartered in a place called Salford, which is part of Greater Manchester in the northwest of England. And I've actually got a team in there. Some of the team are based down in London, and a couple of people we have in Wales, in Cardiff. The important thing about saying we're up in Salford in the northwest of England is about saying this is government sending a very clear message that not everything needs to be centralised in London, that the regional agenda matters and that we're thinking about it. And I'm very excited about that. I originally came from the northwest of England. It's very nice to go back. It's very nice to go back to a different culture and different kinds of people. But it's really important to be seen to be doing something across the UK. Two other areas just to pull out. One is that our role is to work across all of the government investments and a wide range of public sector. But we're actually based in one government department, which is the Department or the Ministry of Science, Innovation and Technology. That brings with it lots of advantage, but also it brings with it an element of potential misconception. We're not just about science, and we're not just about that particular ministry. We're broader than that. The other circle, which for me is one of the most exciting pieces, is that we're a multidisciplinary team. We've got people who are professional civil servants who've worked in the civil service for a long time in the UK, who are really experienced in policy and analysis. And we've brought in new people who've come from much more of a knowledge transfer and a tech transfer environment. I really, really like that intersection of policy and practice, of thinking strategically and at that national policy level, and also thinking very practically. And for me, and one of the exciting things, I talked about career at the outset, one of the exciting things for me is I think that this is a part of developing some new careers. It's about new careers for civil servants who are getting really exposed directly because it's their colleagues and our business unit and what it's there to do with the real problems and the details that they need to think about at a policy level. And it's a really great, I think, career expansion for people who've worked in knowledge commercialisation to suddenly be working in much more of a policy environment with colleagues who think differently. And we were talking yesterday about bringing people together from different academic disciplines and seeing what can happen at that interface. I think we're doing this here ourselves in our office, and I like to think that it could be a model for the future. And it's certainly enlivening people and adding some very interesting conversations. So just to finish off, what levers do we have? Very few. Enthusiasm is probably one of the biggest, but that's also, I think, one of the things that carries many of us through life if we want to be successful. I've talked about our policy teams who are looking at a national level as to what can incentivize these things happening across government. What are the barriers? How do we break them down? Our communities team that are bringing together communities of interest. Our Tech Transfer Strategic Partnerships team, which are people with that research commercialization background, applying it in this new context. And our KAGF, our Knowledge Assets Grant Fund, which is $5 million a year, proof of concept, really high risk. So we can award funding up to £10,000 and all the way through to £250,000 for new opportunities. It is high risk because partly it's there to encourage organisations and individuals to come forward with the opportunities that are in the back of their mind, the knowledge assets that they have and don't quite know how to develop. And to come forward and either get some funding that will give them a very quick go or no-go decision, and as importantly, to connect with us so we can start to help to talk to them, to think about where they're going, to think about their overall strategy. It's going well. We're beginning to see some really exponential interest in the grant fund and some really good opportunities. And we went from a position a few months ago where within the team we were anticipating the will we spend all the money to overnight, because the next round closed, to the we don't have enough panellists to review all of the opportunities that have come in, which was a very happy problem to have, but it was still a problem. But it's going in the right direction. So that's my current job in the UK, which is kind of similar, different and weird. And one of the things that I've really been enjoying there is getting out and about and just talking to the different organisations that we need to support and interact with, our client base, and just learning about the kinds of things that they do. And it's been absolutely fascinating. And I think that there's activities that go on within government organisations that deliberately you don't always know about because some of it's secret. And also because it's not academia, they just don't tell you about it so much. So some of the ideas and the opportunities have really been very, very exciting. And we have one from our National Physics Laboratory where they look at standardisation, analysis. They can do things at really, really granular level. And they have come up with a fabulous new technology that looks at heat change in the foot. They can do it to 0.2 of a degree, which apparently will make the difference between, if you can use that as a device, being able to test at that level of precision can make the difference between developing foot ulcers and diabetic problems or not. What that actually means is if we can get, that's now a spin-out company, if we can move that further, if that can actually be turned into a useful medical device, that will make a difference not only in terms of healthcare economics, it'll make a real difference to people who will be able to test for these small changes, and the difference will be amputation or not. And it's amazing at the moment with the inability to test what effect and what devastating and life-changing effects that has on individuals. And that's something that we would never have expected to come out of an analytical, statistical physics laboratory. So, moving on to international stuff, I thought I would, first of all, just set some context. And, of course, I'm British, so we have Shakespeare. What's in a name? We call it a rose by any other name would smell so sweet. And you see there I've used rose. We talked about the rose book earlier. Nice segue, isn't it? We'll keep the theme going. Why have I put that in? Well, what do we call this business that many of us are involved in, that you're here because you're interested in or actively involved in yourselves? It used to be called technology transfer. Then it became knowledge transfer. In the UK, they got very excited and started to call it knowledge exchange. I don't like that. And many academics don't like that. They think that's what teaching is. It's been called exploitation, but nobody liked that because that sounded awful. It's been called commercialization, but that doesn't work because it's not all about commercializing stuff. Valorization is my absolute favourite, but having gone back to the UK, and given that we had Brexit, it's quite a European term, so I felt I couldn't start using that in case everybody got terribly upset. And then I arrived to discover that we were now getting involved in knowledge asset management. So the upshot of this is the name of things doesn't really affect what they really are, provided that we know what we're doing, and equally as importantly, we can tell and explain to other people what we're doing. So an amusing anecdote. When I arrived in the job, in fact, before I arrived, we had a discussion about, well, should this be the Government Office for Technology Transfer? Because actually, a lot of what we're doing isn't going to be about technologies, and it might send the wrong message. But that had already got a bit of traction and resonance. So there was partly the, oh dear, can we change it now? Followed by the usual, can we find anything better? So we did a lot of crowdsourcing of could we find anything better within the team, and they did as good a job as any consultants could do, and they did it for free, and we couldn't really find anything better. So the nearest we found was something that would resonate with what we actually did around knowledge assets, which was the Government Office for Knowledge Asset Transfer. That became GoCat, and I said, no, not the pet food. There will be a confusion. So we have remained the Government Office for Technology Transfer, and you know what? If nothing else, it sounds really grand, doesn't it? Which is quite fun. For us, the key thing is describing what we do, and that seems to be what matters. But very, very occasionally, you might run into a minister who says tech transfer is very important. Alison, how many spin-outs have you created? We'll come back to that in a minute. So, some little trends that I've been noticing. In the States, as a friend said to me recently, technology transfer is changing, Alison, but they'll never call it knowledge transfer, you know. And what this slide is about is to say that we always tend to look to what's gone on in the States. Rightly so. They started off this business of tech transfer, and they've majored in the technology licensing office, and that's really important. The wording there matters, because those offices have been around taking IP, licensing it, getting it out, and often the spin-off work happens somewhere completely different, and the TLO's job is to license the technology in for royalties, not necessarily to create the spin-offs. And it's certainly never been around partnerships with industry. And one of the things that I've noticed over the last sort of 5 or 8 years is that collaboration, the industry partnership side of the house, is really gaining a lot of momentum at US universities. It's become much more significant. 8 years ago, folk I knew in large multinationals would say, gosh, we'd really rather collaborate with a UK university, even though we look like a US company, because it's just so much easier. They're geared up, they know what they're doing, making a deal is easier, we can find our way in. They're not saying that anymore. So I think that's an important one for us. Not for you here necessarily, because you seem to have this system sorted, I have to say, and I might come back to that later. I think how you join up systems and different activities here is really, really impressive, and it's not something that's easily achieved in a lot of places. But for me, that's sort of sounding particularly when we're looking at multinationals, it's going to be easier, and it's become easier for them to work locally at home in the US. So that's one change. And just a couple of recent quotes from Stanford. You can see this is the head of the Office of Technology Licensing using words like research alliances, accelerator programs, types of partnering deals at Stanford. These are not necessarily words that she would have used before. And just another example from the University of Michigan. Having a corporate alliances unit is really helpful. We're talking about connecting with research programs, IP portfolios, and startups. So there's a lot happening here in terms of how we bring things together. And as I say, I think at UPV, you're ahead of the game. So now I just want to turn to the spin-out environment, because that's always a hot area, and I honestly don't think that's going to stop. we are not alone in the UK in these things being said, but they're said an awful lot in the UK. They were being said in Ireland when I left, which for me was a badge of success because they weren't being said at all when I arrived. But what's often said is universities don't know how to do startups properly, are doing really bad deals, are really bureaucratic, and the KTO is just getting in the way. So we as investors or external founders and entrepreneurs, we just want to get in there, we want to extract the value, and we can do this quickly and we can do it far better. And you only need one or two of those to say that very loudly and to say it to the right people, and that really amplifies in a really big kind of echo chamber. So if you're going to read one thing this year around spin-outs, I would encourage you to read this recent publication from the University Commercialisation and Innovation Policy Evidence Unit in Cambridge. Thomas Coates-Ulrichsen, who runs that, is probably one of the people who knows most about research, commercialisation, policy and analysis that I know. He has been looking at this for years. He understands the environment and he has the trust of very, very many people. What this report does is take a really detailed analysis in a UK context of spin-outs, how they're formed, deal structures and what they look like. The ultimate thesis of this is it's not bureaucratic and it's not wrong. There isn't one way of doing it. And for every time you hear somebody say, oh, the university wants 20%, there's actually some facts and figures in here and some comparisons with the States that explains what that 20% can mean in a whole variety of situations. As in, is that 20% shared with the academic founder before any money comes in? Or is this 20% after a lot of dilution sort of further down line? And he actually proves that in the majority of cases, universities are ending up with 1 or 2%, which is absolutely comparable to what's going on in the USA. And then there's some stuff in there about licensing and royalties as well. But it's just a nice factual bit of evidence. 10U is an international collaboration driven by some of the bigger universities in the UK, but as you can see, along with Stanford, MIT, KU Leuven, they came together, partly encouraged by the government, to look at primarily the spin-out issue, again in response to there are a lot of problems and people don't seem to be satisfied. There's one or two kind of big voices. They are going to be producing something that's due out, I think, in May, called the Use It Guide, and it'll be publicly available. And what they have done is they have worked together and they've also worked with venture capitalists to come up with some overall guidelines around equity in spin-off companies, how to approach it, what you might need to think about. They're resisting talking about percentages because the minute they are down in black and white, everybody will latch onto them and then there will be the magic 10% that everybody's required to use. That will be a useful guide. The reason I've got this here is that I do think that it's incredibly important that those who are experienced and influential within these sectors do come together and do good for the rest of the sector. And tech transfer is a marvellous field to work in because everybody is incredibly collaborative and open. But these guys have given up a phenomenal amount of time to actually do something that is important, not just for them, but actually really on behalf of hundreds more. Getting startups to start quicker, getting spin-offs to happen quicker. I think we're beginning to see much more guidance and much more templating happening. You can see here that at Columbia, they're providing a template for life sciences startups. Something to flag here is nearly everything seems to start with life sciences, which is great, but the numbers are often quite different and the approach is often quite different. And I'm very much trying to encourage organisations like 10U, who've also looked a lot in life sciences, to look more broadly. And you can see there that in Colombia, they're thinking about moving on to climate startups. So this is in here to say, I do think templates are becoming more important. It's about speed and demonstrating speed, but also to say that different sectors require different treatments. Again, in Boulder, they're doing something similar. And when I was back in Ireland, we produced a whole suite of what we call model agreements, template agreements, that covered an entire range of scenarios. They were there like a library, a set of resources that people could go take a look at, get some advice, might use as a frame of reference. I honestly didn't expect, here we go, surprises in my life, I didn't expect how much they'd be used. And what we ended up finding was that a lot of the Irish universities, and indeed SMEs, were using these template agreements because they provided a really good starting point. It was really helpful to say, do you know what, there's a national template agreement that we can use, so why are we fighting about this? Let's use that. The point of them was that it really allowed you to focus on the commercial terms rather than necessarily the boilerplate language. And certainly it was great for SMEs because it gave them a bit of certainty, often in an unknown world when they were working with the university, maybe for the first time or just the second time. And it meant that they could go a fairly long way, because there were guides that accompanied them as well, in terms of their negotiations before they needed to bring in external lawyers. And one of the things that we definitely found with spin-out companies and SMEs who were new to this world was they'd often find legal agreements so challenging that they would go to external lawyers and say, can you put an agreement in place and can you negotiate it for me? And that not only was wrong because it should be them making the business decisions, but it was also really, really expensive. So templates is one trend I've seen coming. Another one is around money, and particularly money in seed funds. So you can see here a nice little, I've just highlighted in bold, challenges in terms of funding spin-offs and a sense that universities are going to have to come up with more money at seed stage and beyond seed stage. And we've seen this all over the place. When I was in Ireland, two of the major universities, UCD and Trinity, got together to create their own venture capital fund. They invested some of their money and then more was raised externally and they brought in a fund manager because they were just not finding that they had VCs who understood early stage university opportunities in the right way. We've seen a lot of universities who not only have created their own seed funds but have the ability to follow through. Cambridge University did this a very long time ago, and the reason for doing it was that they actually, going back to the equity stake, they wanted to be able to keep a reasonable equity in their spin-offs. And the only way that they could do that was through further investment, because the deal that they'd negotiated at the outset, of course, naturally, they got diluted down. And a lot of it's about having investors that understand their base. So look, catalysed by UK government ministry as part of a programme called Connected Capabilities, several universities in the north of England got together to create their own, they call it a company rather than a fund, but commercialisation and investment company, looking at science and IP-rich spin-offs coming out of universities in the north of England. They like to talk about the fact that it's about profit with purpose. For me, that goes back to why are these funds being created? What are they there to do? It's different within the university world, and it's also different within the government world when we're creating spin-outs. This isn't just about short-term financial return, and it's not just about short-termism, it really is about patient capital. We have our own seed fund for public sector spin-offs. And that has several sub-portfolios that you really don't need to know about, except it's got one for knowledge assets, which is great. What's special about this fund is that its objectives are about creating new companies, they're about growth, and they're about returns to the UK economy through jobs and new companies and economic growth, rather than those financial returns that might come back. And again, we have a fund here that understands the nature of what it's dealing with and understands, unlike perhaps a VC that might be used to dealing with a university, that the kinds of opportunities and the people that you're dealing with within a more government sector have different constraints and drivers upon them and need a slightly different approach. So as I begin to come to an end, I couldn't finish without talking about people and about talking about students in particular. And this is way down in Australia, where Alistair Hick, who runs commercialisation at Monash, is saying, look, we are really trying to bring together our tech transfer activities and our student startup activities. We're trying to bring them much closer together because we can see how tech transfer is of value and what we know to these young, dynamic startups. But also, we think that they are incredibly important to the university and they're not separate from anymore. And I know that you here have got many overlaps yourself. I deliberately had that picture with young female students on, because diversity is the other thing that is really high on the list in terms of tech transfer, knowledge transfer, but particularly being looked at in spin-outs. And here's some very sad statistics from the UK in terms of female founders and female directors on spin-off companies. I think the data speak for themselves, but it's fair to say it's still very male-dominated. How can we change it? That's an action for everybody. It's a conscious thought from everybody. Some of it's about role models, but some of it, and one of the things that I saw in Ireland, is just around what's in a name. We had a programme in Ireland called, which was for new startup founders. Startups generally, wherever they came from. It was a great founders programme, it really was. They didn't have very many women involved. So they created one module one year, or one programme, that was called Female Founders Programme. Many, many women came to it. Many more than had ever appeared anywhere else. And they said, oh, well, we thought this was for us. And we thought this was the right environment that we might want to be in. And similarly, a friend of mine in the States used to run a programme with students. And part of that programme involved thinking about sort of startups, business mindset, and they'd have a competitive element in there, you know, go away, work on this problem, come back and pitch. Didn't go down so well. He decided to switch it around a little bit, and instead of making it a competitive pitch, he made it much more of a collaborative share, show and tell, loads of female engagement as well. Some of it is just in the way we think about how we approach things. And I guess my final, which I always used to say when I was on the board of the US Association, diversity isn't just about women. Government, I just wanted to touch on very briefly. Governments are getting really excited about science and technology, and they're getting really excited about commercialisation and innovation again, because they did, and then they didn't, and now they do. So a couple of examples here. Germany, new government, they're creating the new Federal Technology Transfer Agency. Let's see what that looks like, but it's certainly getting a fair amount of money into it. My hope would be it's not a singular central tech transfer office for the entire country, but quite how that plays out, they haven't figured out yet. Australia has said science and the commercialisation of science is a pivotal policy plank in terms of what we're doing nationally. What shocked and surprised quite a few researchers was that the Science Corporate Plan that was just published actually said explicitly part of the purpose of funding research is to advance the commercialisation of science. And that caused a, is it? Nobody told us that. But just to say, this really is getting more recognition. And only this month in England, in Britain, we had a very exciting thing where we had, well, we are on our third Prime Minister since I've been there. I don't think it's my fault. But we had a little bit of a switch around, and we had a very big department that I was part of, a big ministry, and that was cut into 3. And I have to say, the woman that headed it up looks a lot less tired now. That was split into 3, and one of the new departments that was created was the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology. And that's really, again, about saying science matters, innovation matters, and innovative public sector's in there. And this is about part of creating economic change and growth. So we're all very excited about that, but we keep saying all of this takes a really long time. 2 really nice examples that I like. New Zealand, KiwiNet. That's been going for about 11 years. Again, government-funded initiative to start off with, but also has corporate partners. Brings together a number of universities, nearly all of them, to look at what they can do around technology transfer together rather than apart. They all do their own thing, but there's certain things they do together. So running a really big sort of proof of concept fund, training, sharing practice, etc. And they're really rocketing there. It's a really small country, so 35 startups in 2022 is really significant for them. In the UK, we have a stream of funding, and we have had that since about 2000, called the Higher Education Innovation Funding Programme. It's changed as to how it's applied and can be used. It was a game changer. It actually meant that many, many different universities could begin to build tech transfer offices where they didn't have them. It required them to talk about business plans, outputs, impact, what they were driving for, thinking strategically around it. And over time, it's allowed them to use money for different purposes within this broader knowledge exchange arena. But it's there, it's enduring, it's consistent, and it not only does it help a system develop, but it gives universities a confidence to know that it's important to do this. I am going to finish now, but just a couple of hot topics. Knowledge valorization in Europe, brilliant. Guiding principles for knowledge valorization, which I think Fernando and I have been involved in, which is terrific, covers all of those areas. This is really about saying at commission level, what we do, what you do, what you're involved in really does matter. And let's try to get more guidelines around it. Let's make it happen. There'll be a code of practice due to come out. I think it was due to come out early 2023, but we haven't seen it yet. That's all good, but there's an unfortunate, which is that somebody somewhere has decided it would be a terrifically good idea in certain parts of the Horizon Europe programme portfolio to give royalty-free access right to some inventors. This is only for a subset of programmes, but what it does is it completely reverses everything that's been happening over the last 10 or 20 years in Europe to both professionalise the support that's available, to have universities and institutions manage IP, and quite importantly, has the potential to actually contradict national law and policy. We're watching the space on this one to see what will happen. What I really like about it is that bit at the top, which is a number of associations of universities that had people in who cared about knowledge transfer and who were experts in knowledge transfer, came together with universities associations to say, no, this is not a good thing. It caused an amendment. The amendment hasn't gone far enough. So we go again and we see what happens. I'm hopeful, but it is actually about, again, it's about the power of the people who know, who want to do the right thing, stepping up and getting involved, and that takes time. Final hot topics. couldn't possibly talk without talking about patents and technology. I haven't got the answers. I only want to say, you know what it is. We're looking at in the overall fields of AI and data. It's completely new. We don't know where we're going. Look at this, 20% growth rate worldwide. Big data doubling in size every 2 years. Probably since I got that, it's every year. In 2019, VC investments in AI were about 16 billion. This is really, really big business. We don't know what to do. There's no specific patent guidance on it, but it falls under software. How do we exploit, commercialize, valorize AI, big data? How do we define it and categorize it? What about the security and the ethics and the privacy issues and the ownership? Never mind, how do we actually license the blooming stuff, or how do we give access to open data? I'm really comforted to know that you have had or are going to have a session at some stage here about accessing open data. And we need more of these conversations. We need more good practice. We need to understand how best to capitalize on this. But this is one of the joys, I think, of the field that we all work in. Just as you think you've got on top of it, just as you think you've got the guidelines, you think you've got the coalition of people who know what they're doing, a really exciting technology area comes along and you go, okay, time to take a risk and be entrepreneurial again. We don't entirely know what we're doing right now, but let's all get together, share our ideas, and we'll figure our way through this. And there I end. Thank you very much.